July 1941, Sacramento, California. Margaret Winters clutched the telegram in her trembling hand as she stood on the train platform. The journey from Boston had been long, but the news that had brought her west was even more taxing. Her last living relative, Uncle Edward Anderson, had passed away unexpectedly, leaving her his sprawling Victorian home in Sacramento. "Miss Winters?" A tall man in a charcoal suit approached. "I'm Howard Blackwood, your uncle's attorney. I trust your journey was comfortable?" Margaret nodded politely. "As comfortable as circumstances allow. I hadn't spoken to Uncle Edward in nearly 15 years. Yes, well, he became quite reclusive in his later years." Blackwood's eyes darted away momentarily. "Nevertheless, he was quite insistent that everything should pass to you. You were his only living relative, after all." As they drove through Sacramento's tree-lined streets, Margaret studied Blackwood's profile. "How exactly did my uncle die, Mr. Blackwood?" The telegram wasn't specific. The attorney's knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. "Heart failure, according to the doctor. Quite sudden. He was found in his photography darkroom." They pulled up to a grand Victorian house with peeling paint and overgrown gardens. Despite its neglect, the Anderson family home maintained an imposing presence, its 3 stories casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. "Your uncle rarely entertained visitors these past few years," Blackwood explained as he unlocked the front door. "He became obsessed with his photography. It was his life's work." The door swung open with a prolonged creak. The foyer smelled of dust and chemical fixatives. Framed photographs lined the walls, all portraits of solemn-faced men, women, and children. Margaret approached one, studying the stern expression of a young woman in early 1900s attire. "Your uncle's collection," Blackwood explained. "Portraits of the Anderson family through generations." Margaret moved to another photograph, a family of 4, their expressions unnervingly blank. "I don't recognize any of these people. The Anderson family tree has many branches, Miss Winters. Your mother only represented one of them." As Margaret moved down the hall, she noticed something peculiar. In each successive photograph, positioned just behind or beside the subjects, was what appeared to be a coffin, sometimes partially visible, sometimes prominent, but always present. "Mr. Blackwood," she called, her voice suddenly dry. "Why is there a coffin in every photograph?" The attorney stiffened, his expression tightening. "Your uncle had particular artistic sensibilities. They seem so real." Margaret leaned closer to a portrait of a young boy behind whom lay an unmistakable child-sized coffin. "The deeds to the house are in your uncle's study," Blackwood said abruptly, changing the subject. "Along with his will and other important documents. I suggest you review them at your earliest convenience." As Blackwood prepared to leave, Margaret caught his arm. "Were there any unusual circumstances surrounding my uncle's death?" The attorney hesitated, his expression guarded. "Miss Winters, this is an old house with an old history. I'd advise you not to disturb what you don't understand." After Blackwood departed, Margaret stood alone in the foyer, surrounded by the unsmiling faces of distant relatives, each accompanied by that macabre wooden box that seemed to follow the Anderson family through generations like a curse. From upstairs came a sound faint but unmistakable, the mechanical click of a camera shutter. The sound had come from the 3rd floor. Margaret ascended the creaking staircase, each step a deliberate act of courage. The upper landing revealed a narrow corridor with several doors, all closed except one at the far end, which stood slightly ajar. A faint red glow spilled from the opening. Margaret approached cautiously. "Hello?" she called, receiving only silence in return. She pushed the door open to reveal Uncle Edward's dark room. The space was dominated by a large table covered with developing trays, chemical bottles, and stacks of photographic paper. A red safe light cast the room in a bloody hue. Photographs hung from lines strung across the ceiling, gently swaying in the draft from the open door. Margaret examined the hanging prints, all portraits similar to those downstairs, spanning different eras. In each one, the subject stood rigid, expressions vacant, with a coffin lurking somewhere in the frame. On the worktable sat a leather-bound journal. Margaret opened it, revealing her uncle's cramped handwriting. March 15, 1941. Another Anderson has passed. Cousin William's son, merely 12 years old. The camera called to him as it calls to all with Anderson blood. I photographed him yesterday. The coffin appeared, as it always does. Today I received word of his passing scarlet fever, they say. But I know better. It's the camera. It always knows. Margaret flipped through more entries, her hands trembling. April 3, 1941. I've tracked the camera's provenance to Samuel Anderson, who acquired it during the California gold rush. Before that, its origins are murky. What dark bargain did Samuel strike? What price have we all been paying? June 20th, 1941. I can no longer destroy the camera. I've tried fire, water, even a sledgehammer. It remains unmarred. The curse must end with me. I've made arrangements for the estate. Margaret will inherit, but she must be warned. I will write to her tomorrow. Tomorrow had never come for Uncle Edward. Margaret looked up from the journal, suddenly aware of a heavy presence in the corner of the room. There on a tripod stood an antique camera, a large wooden box with brass fittings and a leather bellows. Despite its age, it gleamed as if recently polished. As she approached, she noticed something odd. The lens seemed to shift slightly, like an eye following her movement. On a shelf beside the camera sat a stack of velvet-lined boxes. Margaret opened one to reveal glass plate negatives. She held one up to the red light, another family portrait with a coffin. The last box contained a single negative, still wet with chemicals. Margaret gasped as she recognized the subject, Uncle Edward himself, standing in this very dark room. Behind him, partially obscured in shadow, was the unmistakable shape of a coffin. The negative was dated June 27th, the day before his death. A sudden draft extinguished the safe light, plunging the room into darkness. Margaret stood frozen, heart pounding. In the silence, she heard it again, the mechanical click of a camera shutter. When her eyes adjusted to the darkness, the antique camera was pointed directly at her. Morning light filtered through dusty curtains as Margaret awoke, momentarily disoriented. She'd fled the dark room the previous night, locking herself in what appeared to be a guest bedroom. The camera's mechanical click had followed her down the corridor, though she'd seen no one. After washing her face in the basin, Margaret steeled herself and ventured downstairs. In daylight, the house seemed less menacing, merely neglected rather than malevolent. A knock at the front door startled her. Outside stood a petite woman in her 60s, holding a covered dish. "Good morning, dear. I'm Eleanor Simmons from next door. I saw lights last night and thought Edward might have a visitor." Her smile faltered. "You must be the niece he mentioned." "Margaret Winters," she confirmed, accepting the dish. "You knew my uncle? As well as anyone could, I suppose." Edward kept to himself these past years, especially after ... double quotes. Eleanor hesitated. "Well, after the incidents began," Margaret invited her in, desperate for human company. In the kitchen, Eleanor busied herself making tea while Margaret uncovered the dish of freshly baked apple pie. "What incidents?" Margaret asked, setting out plates. Eleanor's hands stilled. "The deaths. So many in recent years. The Anderson family has dwindled considerably. All from natural causes? That's what the death certificates say." Eleanor sighed, pouring tea. But there were whispers. Edward became obsessed with that old camera of his. Said it was a family heirloom with a history. "Did he photograph you?" Eleanor shook her head firmly. "He offered once. I declined. Something in his eyes, he seemed almost relieved when I refused." Margaret described the photographs lining the walls with their coffin motif. "A memento mori." Eleanor nodded. Victorians often included symbols of death in photographs as reminders of mortality. But Edward's obsession went beyond historical appreciation. After Eleanor left, Margaret explored the house more thoroughly. In the parlor, she found family albums dating back to the 1850s. The earliest photographs showed a bearded Manuel Anderson, presumably standing proudly beside the same camera that now occupied the darkroom. A photograph from 1853 showed Samuel with a business partner outside their photography studio. The partner's face was scratched out. On the back, someone had written "Samuel and Davies" before the bargain. God rest his soul. In an album from 1899, Margaret found a newspaper clipping. "Tragedy strikes photography studio. 3 die in mysterious circumstances." The article described how 3 members of the Davies family were found dead after sitting for portraits. The photographer, Thomas Anderson, claimed no knowledge of how the deaths occurred. The case remained unsolved. As Margaret closed the album, she noticed a shadow pass by the parlor doorway. "Hello?" she called, following the movement into the hall. The front door stood open, swinging gently in the breeze. On the porch lay a manila envelope. Inside was a single photograph, the Anderson family home, taken from across the street. In one of the third-floor windows, a figure stood watching. Though the face was indistinct, Margaret recognized herself. The photograph was still wet. The Sacramento Public Library was housed in a grand Beaux-Arts building downtown. Margaret had decided that researching the Anderson family history might provide answers to the mystery unfolding around her. "I'm looking for information about the Anderson family," she explained to the archivist, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Caldwell, particularly anything related to Samuel Anderson circa 1850s. Mrs. Caldwell's expression shifted subtly. "Anderson? The photography family?" "Yes, that's right. My great-great-grandfather." The archivist led her to a research room and returned with several boxes of materials. The Andersons were quite prominent during the gold rush era. Samuel established one of the first photography studios in Sacramento. Margaret began with a folder of newspaper clippings. Most celebrated Samuel's success as a pioneer of California photography, but one headline from 1854 caught her attention: "Photographer's assistant dies under mysterious circumstances." The article detailed how James Davies, Samuel Anderson's business partner, was found dead in their studio. The cause was listed as apoplexy, but witnesses reported strange markings on the body. Davies had been photographed by Anderson the previous day. "Excuse me," Margaret called to Mrs. Caldwell. "Do you have any information about a camera that belonged to Samuel Anderson?" The archivist frowned. "There are some mentions in his personal papers. It was quite valuable, apparently. Rumored to have special ... properties. Properties?" Mrs. Caldwell hesitated. There were superstitions about early photography. Some believed cameras could capture more than just a person's likeness. Another box contained Samuel's business ledgers. Most entries were mundane, but one stood out. May 18, 1852. Acquired specialty camera from Chinese merchant. Price: significant but worth the investment. Results unlike anything I've seen before. In the margins was a hastily scrawled note. The shadows appear in every plate. Customer J. Miller expired 3 days after sitting. Coincidence? As Margaret continued her research, a pattern emerged. Throughout the decades, the Andersons had prospered as photographers, but their subjects often met untimely ends. Moreover, Anderson family members who took up photography themselves frequently died young. A journal entry from Samuel's son Robert in 1879 was particularly disturbing. Father confessed on his deathbed. The camera was not purchased, but won in a game of chance with a man he described as not entirely human. The bargain, as he understood it, prosperity for the Anderson line, in exchange for feeding the camera's hunger. Each photograph creates a connection. The coffin appears as a portent. Those who see themselves beside it are marked. I have tried to destroy the cursed thing, but it remains unharmed. The hunger must be satisfied. If not with strangers, then it turns to those of Anderson blood. Margaret closed the journal, her hands shaking. According to the family records, Robert had died just 3 months after writing this entry found in his darkroom, apparently from apoplexy, just like Uncle Edward. As she gathered her notes, Margaret noticed a small envelope that had fallen from one of the boxes. Inside was a faded photograph of Samuel Anderson with his family. In the background, partially visible, was a coffin. Scrawled on the back in faded ink, "The camera must be fed. Blood pays for blood." As Margaret left the library, the sun was setting. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Something was waiting for her at the Anderson house, something hungry that had been feeding on her family for generations. Night had fallen by the time Margaret returned to the house. As she approached the front porch, she noticed a figure sitting in the darkness, a man in his 30s wearing a tweed jacket. "Miss Winters?" he called, rising. "I'm David Reynolds from the Sacramento Historical Society. I hope you don't mind the intrusion." Margaret hesitated. "How did you know I was here?" "Howard Blackwood mentioned you'd inherited the property. The Anderson collection is of significant historical interest." His eyes gleamed with enthusiasm. "Your uncle promised to donate his photographs to our archives, but never completed the paperwork." Inside, Reynolds marveled at the photographs lining the hallway. "Extraordinary. The Anderson portfolio is legendary among photography historians. Are you familiar with the unusual elements in these portraits?" Margaret asked carefully. Reynolds leaned closer to a photograph of a 1920s family. "The memento mori?" "Yes, quite a distinctive artistic choice." Edward explained it was a family tradition. "You knew my uncle personally. I interviewed him several times for our journal." Reynolds studied her face. "He never mentioned the family superstitions." "Superstitions?" Reynolds lowered his voice. Edward believed the camera was somehow ... sentient, that it required feeding through the act of photography. He laughed nervously. "Creative minds often develop unusual attachments to their instruments." Margaret didn't return his smile. "Did my uncle ever photograph you, Mr. Reynolds?" he offered, but I declined. "Professional courtesy. I prefer to remain behind the camera myself." He glanced at his watch. "Speaking of which, would you permit me to see the famous Anderson camera? For the historical record?" Against her better judgment, Margaret led him upstairs to the darkroom. The red safe light cast eerie shadows as Reynolds approached the antique camera with reverence. Magnificent craftsmanship. "May I?" He reached toward it. "I wouldn't," Margaret warned, but Reynolds was already running his fingers along the wooden body. "Unusual markings," he murmured, tracing symbols carved into the base. "Not European ... Possibly Chinese?" The camera's lens seemed to gleam in the red light, focusing on Reynolds like a predatory eye. "Mr. Reynolds, what exactly did my uncle tell you about this camera?" Reynolds straightened. "He said it was brought to California during the gold rush, that it had been in the family ever since." He hesitated. He also claimed it had never been successfully photographed itself. Rather odd, don't you think? As if responding to his words, the camera's shutter clicked. Reynolds jumped back. Just settling, he laughed nervously. These old mechanisms contract in the cool evening air. Margaret wasn't convinced. "I think you should leave now, Mr. Reynolds. Of course, forgive my intrusion." He backed toward the door. "But if you'd consider continuing your uncle's donation plans, the Historical Society would be extremely grateful." As they descended the stairs, Reynolds paused by a portrait of a young woman from the 1930s. "Your Aunt Clara, I believe." "Edward's sister?" Margaret examined the photograph. The woman had her eyes, the same Winters family shape. Behind her loomed a coffin, its lid partially open. Edward mentioned she died young. Tragic. Reynolds' voice had softened. "The Anderson family has suffered more than its share of premature deaths." At the front door, Reynolds handed Margaret his card. "Please consider our request about the collection. Those photographs belong in a museum where they can be properly preserved and studied." After he left, Margaret examined the card. Below his name was printed, Photography Division. She dropped the card as if burned. Reynolds had lied about preferring to remain behind the camera. What else had he lied about? From upstairs came the now familiar sound, the mechanical click of a shutter. The camera was active again. In the hall, Margaret noticed something different about the photographs. In each one, the coffin had shifted position, moving closer to the subjects. In Aunt Clara's portrait, the coffin now stood directly beside her, its lid wide open. Sleep eluded Margaret that night. She lay awake, listening to the house's creaks and settlings, unable to distinguish between ordinary noises and something more sinister. Twice she heard what sounded like footsteps in the corridor, but when she gathered the courage to check, she found only empty hallways and closed doors. At dawn, exhausted but determined, she returned to the dark room. In daylight, filtering through a small window, the room seemed less threatening, merely a workspace cluttered with the tools of a photographer's trade. The camera stood silent on its tripod, lens cap in place. Margaret approached it cautiously, examining the Chinese symbols Reynolds had mentioned. They formed a continuous band around the base, intricate characters that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. On the work table lay a leather-bound album she hadn't noticed before. Opening it revealed photographs, arranged chronologically, the earliest from 1852. Each was a portrait of an Anderson family member, and each featured a coffin somewhere in the frame. As the pages progressed through time, Margaret noticed a pattern. The coffins moved closer to their subjects with each subsequent photograph. In the earliest images, they appeared as distant background elements. By the 1920s, they stood directly beside the subjects. And in the most recent photographs, including Uncle Edward's, the coffins were open, with the subjects positioned at the threshold. The final page held a single photograph that made Margaret's blood freeze. It showed her standing in the darkroom doorway the previous night. Behind her, a coffin lid yawned open. The photograph couldn't exist. No one had been in the room when she'd first discovered it. No one human, at least. A loose page fell from the back of the album, a letter in Uncle Edward's handwriting, addressed to her. "My dear Margaret, if you are reading this, then I have failed to break the cycle. And the camera has claimed me as it has claimed so many Andersons before. The burden of knowledge and choice now falls to you. The camera came into our family in 1852, won by Samuel in a game of chance with a merchant from Shanghai. Samuel believed he had acquired merely an expensive instrument. He discovered too late that he had invited a hungry spirit into our family. The bargain is simple but terrible. Prosperity for the Andersons in exchange for lives. The camera feeds on those it photographs. First strangers, then family when no other subjects are provided. The coffins are its way of marking those it has chosen. I tried to end it. Fire, water, physical destruction, nothing harmed it. I considered fleeing, but it followed me once before, appearing in my home in Portland after I'd left it locked in a Sacramento bank vault. There is only one way to satisfy its hunger without sacrifice. Every Anderson who has learned this secret has eventually succumbed to the temptation. I resist no longer. Forgive me for bringing this curse to your door. Perhaps you will find the strength I lacked. Your loving Uncle Edward." The letter ended abruptly, without explaining the one way he had mentioned. Margaret frantically searched for additional pages, but found none. A sound behind her made her turn. The lens cap had fallen from the camera, revealing its glass eye. As she watched, the bellows expanded slightly, like a chest drawing breath. From downstairs came the sound of knocking. Someone was at the front door. Margaret descended the stairs slowly, the knocking growing more insistent. Through the beveled glass, she recognized Eleanor Simmons's silhouette. "Margaret, dear, are you all right?" Eleanor called when the door opened. "I saw that Reynolds man leaving last night. He's been sniffing around since Edward passed." Margaret invited her in, grateful for friendly company. In the kitchen, she prepared coffee while explaining her discoveries about the camera and the pattern of deaths. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression grave. "Edward tried to warn me about that camera. I thought it was just his imagination. He'd grown quite paranoid in recent years." "Did he ever explain how to break the cycle?" Margaret asked, showing her Uncle Edward's letter. Eleanor shook her head. "He spoke in riddles near the end. Something about turning the eye back upon itself." She sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Have you considered simply leaving? Selling the house? Forgetting the camera exists? The camera followed Uncle Edward to Portland when he tried to escape. Then perhaps it should be given what it wants." Eleanor's voice had changed subtly. Margaret looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "The Historical Society has been trying to acquire that camera for decades. If Reynolds offered to take it away, why not let him?" "You think I should donate it?" Eleanor's eyes hardened. "I think you should understand what you possess. That camera has brought the Andersons wealth and prominence for generations. Everything has a price." Margaret stared at her neighbor, suddenly seeing her in a different light. "How long have you known about this, Eleanor?" "Edward and I were more than neighbors, dear." Eleanor set down her cup. "We were partners, in a manner of speaking. He photographed subjects I brought him. Special subjects carefully selected." Margaret's mouth went dry. "You helped him, double quotes veted," Eleanor finished calmly. "Yes, there are always drifters, people no one would miss. Edward had grown squeamish in his old age, but I reminded him of the alternative." "The alternative?" "If the camera isn't fed strangers, it turns to family." Eleanor's smile was cold. "Your uncle's heart gave out because he'd stopped photographing my referrals. He thought he could starve the hunger. Instead, it consumed him." Margaret backed away, reaching for the kitchen knife. Eleanor laughed. "Don't be dramatic. I'm not here to harm you. I'm offering you the same arrangement I had with Edward. I find subjects, you operate the camera, and we both prosper." "You're talking about murder." "I'm talking about sacrifice," Eleanor corrected. "Humanity has always prospered through sacrifice. The Andersons understood this better than most." "Get out," Margaret whispered. Eleanor stood, smoothing her dress. "You'll change your mind when the hunger turns toward you. They always do." At the door she paused. "Edward lasted 3 months after stopping. How long do you think you'll manage?" After Eleanor left, Margaret ran to the telephone in the hall. Her hand shook as she dialed the operator. "Sacramento Police Department, please," she requested, but when she was connected, she froze. What could she possibly say? That her neighbor was procuring victims for a supernatural camera? She replaced the receiver. This was a burden she would have to bear alone. Returning to the dark room, Margaret examined the camera more carefully. Turning the eye back upon itself, she murmured, recalling Eleanor's words. An idea formed, terrible yet simple. What if the camera photographed itself? Margaret positioned a mirror against the wall, directly in the camera's line of sight. With trembling fingers, she removed the lens cap. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the shutter clicked. Once, twice, a third time in rapid succession. The room temperature plummeted. The mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water. In its reflection, Margaret saw not the camera, but a shadowy figure standing behind it. It emaciated, with hollow eyes and elongated fingers gripping the wooden box. The glass cracked with a sound like a gunshot, and Margaret fled from the room. The next morning brought a telegram from Howard Blackwood, important documents discovered in safe. Deposit box. Arriving tomorrow afternoon, do not use the camera. Danger imminent. Margaret spent the day barricaded in the parlor, jumping at every creak and shadow. The mirror trick had clearly agitated whatever entity possessed the camera, but hadn't destroyed it. If anything, the house felt more oppressive than before. That night she dreamed of coffins, dozens of them in rows, lids open like hungry mouths. From each one, hands reached for her, pulling her down into darkness. She awoke to knocking. Dawn light filtered through the curtains as she made her way to the door, expecting Blackwood. Instead, David Reynolds stood on the porch, his expression grim. "Miss Winters, forgive the early intrusion, but I've learned something disturbing about your neighbor, Mrs. Simmons." Margaret hesitated before letting him in. "What about her?" "She's not who she claims to be." Reynolds removed a folder from his briefcase. "Eleanor Simmons died in 1935. The woman next door is her sister, Martha, who disappeared after being questioned about Eleanor's death." He handed Margaret a newspaper clipping with a photograph. The resemblance between the sisters was striking, but there were subtle differences. Martha's eyes were closer set, her mouth thinner. Martha was suspected of involvement in several disappearances around Sacramento, Reynolds continued. Always drifters or transients. Never proven, but the pattern was concerning. Why are you telling me this? Reynolds looked uncomfortable. After our conversation, I did some research into your uncle's collection. The Historical Society has copies of some early Anderson photographs. I noticed the ... recurring motif. The coffins. Yes. And the subsequent deaths of those photographed. He swallowed hard. Miss Winters, I believe your uncle may have been involved in something ... criminal, possibly with Martha Simmons as an accomplice. Margaret studied him. You think they were murderers? I think the evidence suggests a disturbing pattern. He leaned forward. Let me help you. The society can take possession of the camera and photographs for safekeeping and further study. There was something in his eyes, a hunger that reminded her of Eleanor's, or rather Martha's. Why are you really here, Mr. Reynolds? His smile faltered. I told you want the camera for yourself, don't you? Margaret stood. You know what it can do. Reynolds's expression changed, calculation replacing concern. Your uncle mentioned the cameras, special properties during our interviews. I dismissed it as superstition until I researched the mortality rate of Anderson photography subjects. It's not a tool, Mr. Reynolds. It's a curse. A gift, he corrected. Properly managed, it could be quite beneficial. I could take it off your hands for a generous sum, of course. And who would you photograph? Reynolds shrugged. There are always subjects available to those who know where to look. Martha understood this. Get out, Margaret ordered. Reynolds stood, his manner suddenly threatening. Think carefully, Miss Winters. That camera has kept the Anderson family wealthy for generations. The price is small compared to the rewards. The price is murder. The price is progress, he countered. Every advancement in human history has required sacrifice. Why should this be different? After Reynolds left, Margaret sank into a chair, overwhelmed. Both Martha and Reynolds wanted the camera not to destroy it, but to use it for their own gain. How many others knew of its power? How long before they came for it? As if in response to her thoughts, the telephone rang. Margaret? Howard Blackwood here. I'm on my way with Edward's papers. Don't let anyone in the house until I arrive. And whatever you do, stay away from that camera. Hanging up, Margaret made her decision. She wouldn't wait for Blackwood. She wouldn't flee like Uncle Edward had tried to do. She would end this today. Margaret climbed the stairs to the dark room, determination overcoming her fear. Inside, the camera waited, its brass fittings gleaming in the morning light. No more, she whispered, approaching it. No more deaths. No more sacrifices. She remembered Uncle Edward's words. There is only one way to satisfy its hunger without sacrifice. Not by feeding it strangers. Not by allowing it to consume family. But perhaps by offering it something else entirely. Margaret worked methodically, arranging the darkroom exactly as she needed it. She positioned the camera facing the door and removed the lens cap. On the workbench, she placed Uncle Edward's journal, open to his final entry. When everything was ready, she went downstairs to wait. Martha Simmons arrived first, not bothering to knock. I've been thinking about our conversation, she announced, striding into the foyer. You need guidance in managing your inheritance. The camera requires regular feeding, but with proper care. I've made my decision, Margaret interrupted. Come upstairs, I'll show you. Martha followed eagerly, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. In the dark-room doorway she paused, noticing the camera's position. What are you doing? Ending it, Margaret replied, staying in the hallway. Look at the journal. As Martha stepped into the room to examine the journal, the camera's shutter clicked. She whirled around, eyes wide with understanding and fear. No, she cried, lunging for the door, but it slammed shut of its own accord. Margaret listened to Martha's screams with grim resolve. They didn't last long. When silence fell, she opened the door cautiously. The room was empty except for the camera. On the development table lay a wet photograph, Martha standing in the doorway, a coffin open behind her. Inside the coffin, Martha's face stared up in frozen terror. The front door knocker sounded. David Reynolds had arrived. Margaret let him in, leading him upstairs with the same promise she'd made Martha. Reynolds was more cautious, hesitating at the dark-room door. Where's the camera? Inside. I've decided to accept your offer. Reynolds stepped into the room, immediately noticing Martha's photograph. He backed away, but too late, the shutter had already clicked. His disappearance was quicker than Martha's, with barely a gasp of surprise. The new photograph showed Reynolds half inside a coffin, his expression one of dawning horror. Howard Blackwood was the last to arrive, carrying a leather portfolio. Margaret, are you all right? The door was open. She met him on the landing. Did you bring Uncle Edward's papers? Blackwood nodded, opening the portfolio. Inside were dozens of photographs, all portraits of an Anderson family member paired with someone else. In each, the non-Anderson stood at the threshold of a coffin. Your uncle discovered the pattern, Blackwood explained. The camera requires regular feeding, but it doesn't have to be innocent blood. Edward found that it would accept ... substitutes. People who knew about the camera and wanted to use it, Margaret realized, precisely. Those who sought to exploit its power for their own gain. Blackwood glanced toward the dark room. Has anyone approached you about the camera? Martha Simmons? And David Reynolds. Blackwood's expression darkened. Both were associates of your uncle before he understood the true nature of the bargain. Did they offer to help you manage the camera's hunger? Margaret nodded. Then they sealed their own fates, Blackwood sighed. The camera doesn't just feed on life, it feeds on greed, on the willingness to sacrifice others for personal gain. How do you know all this? I've been the Anderson family attorney for 40 years. I've watched the pattern repeat with each generation. He handed her the portfolio. These are all the willing sacrifices your uncle made. People who sought to use the camera's power and instead fell victim to it. Can it be destroyed? Blackwood shook his head. Not destroyed, but contained. The bargain your ancestor struck cannot be broken, but it can be ... managed. By feeding it people like Martha and Reynolds. By feeding it those who would feed on others, Blackwood corrected. A fitting symmetry, don't you think? Margaret considered this moral calculus a predator that preyed on predators. Not justice, exactly, but perhaps a kind of balance. What happens now? She asked. Now, Miss Winters, you decide. The camera's yours, as is the responsibility it entails. You can continue your uncle's work, photographing only those who would use it for harm. Or you can lock it away and hope it remains dormant. And if I refuse both options? Blackwood's expression was grave. Then I fear it will find its own subjects, starting with those closest to it. Blood calls to blood, Miss Winters. The Anderson legacy is not easily escaped. 1 year later, Margaret sat in the parlor of the Anderson house, which no longer felt quite so oppressive. The photographs still lined the walls, but she'd grown accustomed to their somber faces and their shadowy companions. The doorbell rang, the newly installed electric one, part of her renovations to bring the old Victorian into the modern era. On the porch stood a young man in an expensive suit, his smile too practiced to be genuine. Miss Winters? I'm James Crawford, representing Western California Development. We're interested in purchasing your property for a substantial sum. Margaret invited him in, listening patiently to his pitch. The company wanted to demolish the house and build modern apartments progress, he called it, though his eyes kept drifting to the antique furnishings, assessing their value. And what about the Anderson photographic collection? She asked when he finished. It's quite valuable, I'm told. Crawford waved dismissively. We'd allow you to retain any personal items, of course. Though if you're interested in selling the collection separately, I know several collectors who would pay handsomely, including yourself. Margaret asked, noting how his eyes lingered on the photographs. Crawford smiled. I do have a modest interest in historical photography. Your uncle's work is quite ... distinctive. Have you heard the stories about the Anderson camera? Margaret asked casually. Crawford's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of avarice quickly concealed. Mere superstition, I'm sure. Though fascinating from a folkloric perspective. Perhaps you'd like to see it? The camera is still in working condition. Crawford tried to hide his eagerness, if it wouldn't be an imposition. As they climbed the stairs, Crawford revealed his true purpose. The camera's rumored to have certain ... properties. Properties that could be quite valuable to someone who understands them. And you understand them? I've researched the Anderson family extensively. The pattern of success following photography sessions is statistically improbable. There's something special about that camera, something worth far more than this outdated house. In the dark room, the antique camera stood on its tripod, meticulously maintained. Margaret had replaced the red safe light with normal electric bulbs, but otherwise the room remained as Uncle Edward had left it. Crawford approached the camera reverently. Magnificent craftsmanship. Chinese, isn't it? You seem well informed, Margaret observed. I told you I've researched your family. His pretense of casual interest had vanished. I know what this camera can do, Miss Winters. And I know you've been using it, just as your uncle did. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Using it? Reynolds and that Simmons woman disappeared after visiting you, just like others who inquired about the camera over the years. Crawford smiled coldly. Don't worry, I'm not here to expose you. I'm here to propose a partnership. What kind of partnership? I have access to subjects people who won't be missed. You have the camera. Together we could achieve greatness. His eyes gleamed with ambition. Think of what we could accomplish with its power. Wealth, influence, anything we desire. Margaret sighed. They always revealed themselves eventually. Would you like to be photographed, Mr. Crawford, for posterity? He hesitated only briefly before nodding. A demonstration would be appropriate. To confirm my theories, Margaret gestured for him to stand before the backdrop. Look directly into the lens, please. The shutter clicked. Crawford's smile faltered as the temperature in the room plummeted. What? The shadows behind him deepened, forming the now familiar shape of a coffin. Crawford turned, seeing it for the first time. No! He gasped, lunging for the door. Margaret watched him passively as the shadows enveloped him. His scream was cut short, leaving only silence and the faint smell of photographic chemicals. On the development table, a new portrait appeared, Crawford half consumed by a coffin, his expression frozen in terror. Another one who thought he could control the hunger rather than be consumed by it. Later that evening, Howard Blackwood arrived for their monthly meeting. She handed him Crawford's business card. Western California Development will need a new representative, she explained. Mr. Crawford has departed. Blackwood nodded, understanding without needing details. That's the third this year. They're coming more frequently now. Word is spreading about the camera. Collectors, occultists, opportunists, all thinking they can master what they don't understand. And you continue to protect the public by removing those who would misuse it, Blackwood observed. Your uncle would be proud. Margaret wasn't certain pride was the appropriate response to what she'd become, a guardian of a cursed object, feeding it the greedy and the cruel to prevent it from consuming innocence. Not quite a hero, but perhaps not a villain either. Have you considered my suggestion about documenting the process? Blackwood asked. Future caretakers would benefit from your insights. Margaret had indeed begun a journal, recording each feeding and her observations about the camera's behavior. The hunger seemed to subside after consuming those with ill intent remaining dormant for increasingly longer periods. I've started a record, she confirmed, for my successor. You're still planning to remain childless, then? Margaret nodded firmly. The Anderson bloodline ends with me. When I'm gone, the camera will pass to the Historical Society with explicit instructions for its containment. Blackwood looked skeptical. The hunger will eventually awaken with or without an Anderson to guide it. Then we'll have to ensure it remains well-fed until then. She showed him a folder of correspondence letters from collectors, researchers, and occultists, all inquiring about the famous Anderson camera. A waiting list, Blackwood observed with grim amusement. The camera provides a service, in its way, Margaret said. It removes those who would prey on others for power or gain. A predator that consumes other predators, Blackwood mused. There's a certain poetry to it. As twilight deepened outside, Margaret gazed at the portraits lining the walls, generations of Andersons who had carried this burden before her. In each one, the coffin waited, a reminder of the price that came with the camera's power. She had made her peace with the legacy, not by fleeing it like Uncle Edward had attempted, nor by exploiting it as Martha and Reynolds had desired, but by directing its hunger toward those who deserved it. The camera would outlive her, as it had outlived all the Andersons before her. But while she lived, she would ensure its appetite was sated only by the willing, those whose greed and ambition led them to seek power at any cost, only to discover too late that they themselves were the sacrifice. Outside, a car pulled up to the curb. Another visitor arriving after dark, another hungry soul seeking the camera's power, unaware they were offering themselves as its meal. Margaret checked her appearance in the mirror, practiced her welcoming smile, and went to answer the door. The Anderson legacy continued, one photograph, one coffin at a time,